In 1982, the Washington Post printed a sentence about American ski history. It said a skier named Jimmy Hugo was the first American ever to win an Olympic medal in skiing. That sentence is false. Gretchen Fraser had already done it, 34 years earlier, at St. Moritz, in 1948. A gold medal. A silver medal. The first Olympic skiing medals any American had ever won, by a woman the press that year called an unknown housewife. She was not unknown. She was a two-time national champion. And by 1982, when a national newspaper erased her from the record entirely, Gretchen Fraser was still alive to read it. This is not a story about a woman forgotten by accident. It's a story about what got left off the page while she was still writing the rest of her life: the war work, the business she ran, the veterans she taught to ski again, the generation of Olympians she trained afterward. Somebody has finally gone back through it all. Here is the full account. Every myth needs an origin built for it after the fact. Gretchen Fraser's origin refuses to cooperate. She was born Gretchen Koenig on February 11, 1919, in Tacoma, Washington, to a German father, Willibald, and a Norwegian mother, Clara. Clara was the skier, a woman who had grown up with snow the way some people grow up with language, instinctively, and who spent years of her life, unpaid and mostly unrecorded, campaigning to open Mount Rainier to public skiing. There is no ledger entry for that labor anywhere. No trust fund resulted from it. It exists now only as a line in a handful of biographical footnotes, and as the reason her daughter received a pair of skis. Here is the detail every tidy sports myth erases. Gretchen did not start skiing at 3, or 5, or 10. She first stood on skis in December 1932, at Paradise Valley on the south slopes of Mount Rainier, at 13 years old. In a sport that rewards early starts more than almost any other, she was, by the standards of her own era, late. Late and then fast. She became president of the ski club at Stadium High School in Tacoma. She raced for the ski team at the University of Puget Sound, winning competitions on Mount Rainier while other girls her age were being told competitive skiing wasn't ladylike. The gap between started at 13 and national-level racer within a handful of years is not a footnote. It's the whole shape of her character, stated once, before the story even properly begins. She did not have time to waste, and she refused to waste it. Before she ever wore a national team bib, she was already skiing for an audience that had no idea her name, because Hollywood needed her legs, not her face. In 1937 and again in 1941, Fraser worked as the skiing stand-in for the ice skater Sonja Henie in the films Thin Ice and Sun Valley Serenade. Watch either movie and the skiing on screen is hers. The credit is not. That is worth sitting with for a moment because it is a preview, in miniature, of the pattern this entire film is tracking: real skill, performed in full, attributed to someone else's name on the poster. It happened to her in a movie credit at 18. It would happen to her in a national newspaper at 63. In 1937, on a train bound for central Idaho, she met Donald Fraser, a member of the U.S. Olympic ski team the year before, at the 1936 Garmisch-Partenkirchen Games, and a Northwest champion out of the University of Washington. Most retellings frame this meeting as a romance. A young champion notices a promising newcomer, sparks fly, a wedding follows. Look at what Don Fraser actually said about that first impression, and the romance reads differently. He found her form, in his own words, awkward yet promising. That is not the language of infatuation. That is the language of a coach filing a scouting report. What began between them in 1937 was not simply a courtship. It became, almost from the first season, a training partnership, and it would go on to become something closer to a joint enterprise than the word marriage alone captures. They married in Tacoma, on a date recorded variously as October or November of 1939, and did not honeymoon somewhere useless. They moved to Sun Valley, Idaho, because Sun Valley put Gretchen within daily reach of Otto Lang, one of the most demanding ski instructors in the country, a man who would later leave skiing altogether to direct Hollywood films. The newlywed Fraser's choice of home was not a lifestyle decision. It was a training decision made by two athletes who happened to also be married to each other. Both of them made the 1940 U.S. Olympic team. Both of their Olympic dreams were cancelled in the same season by the same war, when the 1940 Winter Games were called off entirely. There is no prenuptial agreement anywhere in this record, because there was no fortune on either side worth protecting with one. What there was, instead, was a detour neither of them had chosen, one that would run for 8 years before either Fraser stood on Olympic snow again, and that would prove to be the most consequential stretch of her life, for reasons that had nothing to do with medals. When Dawn Fraser entered the Navy, the resort that had shaped Gretchen's entire competitive life, Sun Valley, stopped being a ski resort. It became a U.S. Naval Special Hospital filled with wounded and disabled servicemen sent west to recover. For most of the war, the woman who would win Olympic gold did not race. Almost every account of her life treats the stretch as dead air, the quiet years between promising young skier and gold medalist, a gap to move through quickly on the way to St. Moritz. It deserves the opposite treatment. Gretchen Fraser spent the war skiing in Otto Lang's military training films made for the 10th Mountain Division, the unit that would go on to fight in the Italian Alps, many of its veterans later founding the American ski industry itself. And she worked directly with the wounded who filled the hospital her old training ground had become. At the Sun Valley Naval Hospital, she helped implement the first application of the Outrigger ski system, an early adaptive skiing method using modified forearm crutches with small skis attached, so that amputee veterans could learn to ski again on prosthetic limbs. Some of them were learning balance from scratch, on snow, with limbs that had never touched it before. She taught swimming and horseback riding to wounded soldiers at what would become Madigan Army Medical Center in Fort Lewis, Washington. She worked, too, at Burrell Hospital in Brighton, Utah. This work continued past the war's end, not because anyone assigned it to her, but because she kept showing up. None of it earned a headline in 1943. None of it sits on a medal stand. But hold it up against that Washington Post sentence from 1982, a sentence crediting a man with a first that had already belonged, for 16 years, to a woman who spent the years before her own medal teaching disabled veterans to move through the world again. The country that eventually forgot her Olympic achievement had, at the time, barely registered this one at all. That is the real gap in the record. Not what she did. What got written down. By 1947, tryouts opened for the 1948 Olympics. Gretchen Fraser was 28 years old, married to a man running a young business, and, by her own account, convinced she had been away from real competition too long to make the team. Dawn pushed her to try anyway. She made the team, and not marginally. She took the #1 starting position and held it through the entire European training season. 28 years old, most of a decade removed from serious international racing, and still the fastest qualifier on the roster. That detail alone should have ended any narrative about her being an underdog. It didn't. The underdog framing survived all the way to race day because it made a better story than the truth. The truth about the team she joined in St. Moritz was worse than underdog. It was under-resourced. The U.S. women's ski team arrived at the 1948 Games with no coach. Budget hadn't stretched to cover one. For a stretch of training, the women were folded in with the men's team, a different discipline entirely, coached inconsistently by whichever male skier happened to be free that day. Team manager Alice Kyer, the woman who had personally assembled the first U.S. women's ski team back in 1935 and had spent over a decade building American women's ski competition from nothing, watched this arrangement fail and, 3 weeks before the games began, paid out of her own pocket to hire a dedicated coach, Walter Heensley, so the American women would finally have someone training them on their own terms. That detail belongs permanently in this record, an Olympic medal made possible, in real part, by one woman quietly spending her own money to fix what her own federation hadn't funded. In the Alpine combined, Fraser won silver. Days later, in the slalom, she drew the worst possible starting position, bib number 1, meaning she had to break trail through untouched snow with no one's line ahead of her to read. Her first run was the fastest in the field, by 0.2 of a second. As she stood ready for her second run, the telephone connection used for timing between the top and bottom of the course failed. She waited in the start gate for 17 minutes, no clock she could trust, no explanation, just cold and stillness, and an entire Olympic result hanging on a broken phone line, while nerves that had nothing left to prove kept proving themselves anyway. Then she skied the second fastest run of the field regardless. Combined time, 1 minute, 57.2 seconds. The silver medalist, Switzerland's Antoinette Mayer, finished half a second behind her. Austria's Erika Mariner took bronze, further back still. Half a second, after a 17-minute delay that could easily have unraveled anyone. That is the entire distance between first American to win Olympic gold in skiing and a name nobody remembers. The press called her an unknown American housewife who had shocked the field. She was a defending national slalom and combined champion with more than a decade of competitive results behind her. The surprise was never in her skill. It was in what the reporters had bothered to learn about her before they sat down to write. Within weeks of winning gold, Gretchen Fraser announced she was quitting competition. American newspapers ran the story flatly, almost as a footnote to the medals themselves, a champion, at the height of her fame, walking away. Nobody in 1948 seems to have asked the obvious follow-up question, walking away to what? There was no professional women's ski circuit to turn pro on. No modern endorsement infrastructure to build a career from a gold medal. Retirement, for a female Olympic champion in 1948, wasn't a lifestyle choice weighed against other lucrative options. It was closer to the only option there was. She had already done, at 29, the single thing her sport had any structure in place to reward her for. What came after that would have to be built without a script. She came home first to a ticker tape parade down the streets of New York. Tacoma made her guest of honor at its 1948 Daffodil Parade. Vancouver and Portland staged their own receptions. Wheaties put her likeness into cartoon advertisements distributed across more than a dozen comic book titles in 1953, Batman, Action Comics, Tarzan, Donald Duck, a level of visibility most athletes, male or female, never reach in their entire careers. For roughly 18 months, Gretchen Fraser was one of the most recognizable women in American sport, a fuel company bookkeeper from Vancouver, Washington, sharing panels with Batman and Donald Duck in the same printing run. Then it stopped. Not dramatically, there was no scandal, no fall from grace. It simply ended, the way most athletic fame from that era ended, because there was no infrastructure built to sustain it. The parade wound down, the comic books were pulped or forgotten in attics, and Gretchen Fraser went home to Vancouver, Washington, and went back to work. After the war, Don and Gretchen Fraser opened an oil and gasoline distribution business in Vancouver, Washington. The way people who knew them described the arrangement is worth repeating precisely because it cuts directly against the story this kind of documentary usually tells. Don drove the trucks. Gretchen kept the books. Sit with that division for a moment. This was not a wife locked out of the family finances, fed an allowance, kept deliberately ignorant of what the business made or owed. She was the business's financial memory. Every account, every figure, every week's receipts, she was the one who could tell you, without looking anything up, exactly where the company stood. Whatever complexities existed inside the Fraser marriage, financial exclusion was not one of them. The record shows partnership, with Gretchen holding the actual pen. It was in the middle of running that business, a business that left her little spare time to train, that Don encouraged her to try out for the 1948 team anyway. That decision cost the business her labor for a season. It also handed the business a level of free publicity no advertising budget could have bought. Whether that encouragement was generosity, business instinct, or both at once, the record doesn't let us fully separate, and it's more honest to leave that tension standing than to resolve it with a clean answer the facts don't support. Retirement from competition did not mean retirement from the sport. In 1952, Gretchen Fraser returned as coach of the U.S. Women's Olympic ski team, the very role that had been missing, unfunded, 4 years earlier, when Alice Kyer had to pay for a coach out of her own pocket. Fraser had lived the exact gap she was now hired to close. And she kept closing it, informally, for the next 4 decades. At Sun Valley, she became a mentor to generation after generation of American ski racers, among them 2-time Olympic gold medalist Andrea Mead Lawrence, and later Susie Carrock, Kristen Cooper, and Picabo Street, names that would themselves become synonymous with American skiing. She also mentored Paralympian Muffy Davis, a direct continuation of the wartime rehabilitation work she'd begun at the Sun Valley Naval Hospital more than 30 years before. Line those names up and something becomes visible that no single medal count can show. Gretchen Fraser is not simply a data point in American ski history. She is closer to a hinge, one woman standing between the disabled veterans she taught in 1944 and the Paralympian she mentored in the 1980s, between her own unfunded, coachless Olympic team of 1948 and the champions she personally helped develop for 40 years afterward. A one-time medal tells you what she won. A 4-decade mentorship tells you what she built. The second number rarely makes it into the same sentence as the first. Somewhere in the middle of running a fuel company, coaching Olympic hopefuls, and settling into a life that no longer made national headlines, Gretchen Fraser started flying. She'd begun before the 1948 Olympics, almost as a footnote to everything else happening in her life that year. Inspired by her husband, who was himself a pilot. She became a licensed private pilot in 1958 and kept flying for decades, eventually logging more than 3,000 flight hours, a number that belongs to a serious aviator, not a hobbyist with a license she rarely used. She later flew as a co-pilot alongside Chuck Yeager, the test pilot who broke the sound barrier, and was inducted into the Boise, Idaho chapter of the 99s, the International Women Pilots Organization first led decades earlier by Amelia Earhart. 3,000 hours in the air is a second full career, built almost entirely outside the frame of the story anyone was telling about her. No newspaper ran a headline the day she crossed 1,000 hours, or 2,000. It simply happened, one flight at a time, while the world's memory of her stayed frozen at 29 years old mid-slalom, pigtails flying against the snow. The full record refuses to stay frozen there. It keeps moving for another 46 years, and most of what happens in those years never made it into the story at all. About 15 years after the war, Fraser helped organize the Flying Outriggers ski club at Mount Hood, Oregon, the first adaptive ski club in the United States. It was a direct descendant of the Outrigger system she had helped pioneer at the Sun Valley Naval Hospital in the 1940s, now formalized into an organization that would train instructors and expand adaptive skiing nationally. In Portland, separately, she became a founding member of the Oregon Institute for Rehabilitation, a clinic that started small, staffed largely by volunteers from the Junior League, built to serve people rebuilding their bodies and their lives after injury or illness. She sat on its board for 27 years. 27 years. Longer than most careers last. Longer than most marriages last. In 1984, the work finally received a name in a national record. Fraser was named National Paralympic Coach of the Year, an honor that arrived not for a single competitive season, but as recognition of 4 decades of unbroken, largely undocumented adaptive skiing work stretching back to a wartime hospital most Americans have never heard of. By any honest measure of where a person actually spends their finite hours, the founding of a national adaptive ski club and 27 years on a rehabilitation board outweigh the 18 months of parades, and even the 90 seconds of an Olympic slalom, several times over. And it is the part of her story that receives almost universally, the least attention. Even biographical tributes written specifically to honor her tend to rush past it on the way back to St. Moritz, because a gold medal makes cleaner television than a folding chair in a rehabilitation clinic boardroom. The ledger of what a person actually does with their years and the ledger of what gets narrated about them afterward are not the same document. Return now to where this film began. By 1982, Gretchen Fraser was 63 years old, 34 years past her Olympic medals, 24 years into her pilot's license, 2 years past organizing the first adaptive ski club in the country, and a national newspaper writing about the history of American skiing produced a sentence crediting Jimmy Huga as the first American skier ever to win an Olympic medal, a claim demonstrably, checkably false, and false in a way that erased a specific, named, still living woman from a record she had personally built. This was not an isolated slip. It reflects a pattern later biographers have documented directly, mid-century accounts of women's sports achievements, the books published through the 1950s and into the 1970s that mention Fraser et al. Treat those achievements, by later assessment, with a dismissiveness bordering on condescension, framing serious athletic accomplishment as a novelty rather than a record worth accurately preserving. Fraser wasn't singled out. She was subjected to the same ordinary, background erasure applied to women's sporting achievement for most of the 20th century, and the 1982 error simply happened to involve a fact concrete enough, checkable enough, that the erasure became undeniable rather than merely implied. No lawsuit followed. No correction ran with anything close to the prominence of the original mistake. And here the record goes honestly quiet. There is no surviving public statement from Gretchen Fraser responding to that error. We don't know if she read it. We don't know what it cost her, privately, to watch her own achievement handed to someone else in print, 14 years before her death. A documentary built on forensic honesty has to resist the temptation to invent that reaction for her. The silence itself is the more honest ending to this thread, a woman erased in print, and no record of her ever being asked how that felt. In 1986, Fraser underwent heart bypass surgery. She kept skiing nearly every day afterward, for the remaining 8 years of her life, a detail that resists easy sentiment and demands it in equal measure. A woman in her late 60s, recovering from open-heart surgery, still lacing boots and walking back out onto the same kind of slope she'd first stood on at 13, more than 50 years earlier. The following year, 1987, the Oregon Sports Hall of Fame finally inducted her, 39 years after her gold medal, and roughly 3 decades after Oregon's own Rehabilitation Institute had benefited from her unpaid board service. It joined a slower accumulation of recognition that had started in 1957 with the Tacoma Pierce County Sports Hall of Fame, and continued in 1960, when both the National Ski Hall of Fame and the State of Washington Sports Hall of Fame inducted her in the same year, 12 years after St. Moritz. Track that timeline against her actual life and the lag becomes impossible to miss. 12 years passed before the ski world formally enshrined her. 22 more passed before Oregon, the state where she'd spent 27 unpaid years on a rehabilitation board, got around to its own recognition. By the time both had happened, she had already spent nearly 4 decades doing the underlying work the honors were nominally for. The medals came first, in 1948. Almost everything else came late, arriving, again and again, well after the labor that earned it was long since finished. Don Fraser died in January 1994, 54 years into their marriage. Gretchen Fraser died 36 days later, on February 17, 1994, 6 days after turning 75, during the very Winter Olympics being broadcast that month, the same event that had made her briefly famous nearly half a century earlier. They are buried together in the city cemetery in Ketchum, Idaho, close to the Sun Valley slopes where the entire partnership, athletic, marital, financial, had effectively started. There is no contested will in this record. No disputed estate. No fortune redirected at the last moment to someone she didn't choose. And that absence is worth naming directly, because an audience trained by other documentaries to expect a hidden betrayal deserves better than one invented to fit the format. Not every consequential woman's story ends in a buried financial wrong. Sometimes the injustice isn't in the money at all. It's in the record, in what got written down as history, and what got left as a footnote to a man who crossed a similar finish line 16 years later and, for one newspaper at least, got to be first. The final entry in this record did not happen while Gretchen Fraser was alive to see it. In 2020, Idaho's governor formally recommended her for a national monument under a federal executive order on American heroes. 2 years later, in 2022, 74 years after St. Moritz, 28 years after her death, the United States Olympic and Paralympic Hall of Fame finally inducted her, in its legend category. A ski magazine covering the induction summarized the gap in its own headline, calling it a recognition of America's first Olympic ski medalist, arriving 74 years late. 74 years is longer than most human lives. It is longer than her own life was by a full year. The country that produced a false sentence about her in 1982 took until 2022 to formally correct, at the highest level available, exactly whose name belonged at the start of American Olympic skiing history. In 2023, Stadium High School in Tacoma, the same school where a teenage Gretchen Koenig had once served as president of the ski club, inducted her into its wall of recognition, closing a loop that had opened almost 90 years earlier. None of these honors reached her. She died in 1994. Every induction after that date is the record correcting itself for an audience that includes everyone except the one person who actually did the work. Lay it all out in one place, the way the evidence allows, and nothing more than the evidence allows. One late start, at 13, in a sport built to reward early ones. 1 8-year wartime Dieter spent skiing in training films for the 10th Mountain Division and teaching amputee veterans to ski again on new limbs. 1/2-second margin between an Olympic gold medal and total obscurity, survived alongside a 17-minute wait in a broken timing start gate. 1 retirement, at 29, into a sport with no professional path built for her to walk. 1 business, whose books she kept in her own hand. 1 return to coaching in 1952, closing the exact gap that had nearly cost her country a gold medal 4 years earlier. 4 decades spent mentoring the Olympians and Paralympians who came after her: Andrea Mead Lawrence, Susie Garak, Kristen Cooper, Picabo Street, Muffy Davis. 1 adaptive ski club, the first of its kind in America, built from a wartime rehabilitation program she pioneered by hand. Over 3,000 hours logged in the air, much of it beside one of the most famous pilots in American history. 27 years on 1 rehabilitation board that outlasted her fame by decades. 1 National Paralympic Coach of the Year award, arriving decades into work no one had originally asked her to do. 1 sentence, printed in 1982, that erased her from a history she had helped create 34 years earlier, while she was still alive to read it. 54 years of marriage. 36 days between her husband's death and her own. And 1 National Hall of Fame induction that arrived 74 years after the medal that earned it, 28 years after she was no longer alive to receive it. That is not a ledger of money taken from a woman by the people closest to her. It's a ledger of credit that was never fully entered in her name to begin with, and had to be reconstructed afterward, piece by piece, by biographers such as Llewellyn Pfeiffer, whose 1996 book, Gretchen's Gold, the story of Gretchen Fraser, America's first gold medalist in Olympic skiing, remains one of the only full-length accounts of a life this thoroughly documented on the surface, and this thinly understood underneath. She did not die wealthy, and she did not die ruined. She died having spent 46 years past her Olympic medal building a second life, and a third, that most tellings of her story have no room for, because 57 seconds of a slalom run make cleaner television than 27 years in a rehabilitation clinic boardroom, and a parade is easier to film than 3,000 quiet hours spent learning to fly, and a medal ceremony is easier to remember than 4 decades spent quietly building the athletes who came after. Her medals now sit behind glass, on display in a restaurant at the Sun Valley Lodge named in her honor. A ski run at Sun Valley's Seattle Ridge carries her name. A neighborhood park in Vancouver, Washington carries her name. That is the accounting the public eventually settled on: a dining room, a trail marker, a park sign, a trivia night fact about being first. It is true, and it is a fraction of what actually happened. The rest of it, the uncredited runs skied for a movie star's stunt double work at 18, the veterans she taught to move again on prosthetic limbs, the business ledger she kept by hand, the champions she mentored across 4 decades, the adaptive ski club she helped build from nothing, the 3,000 hours in the air, the 27 years on one board no camera ever visited, never made it into most versions of her story at all. Not because anyone deliberately buried it. Because until someone sat down and actually added it up, nobody had bothered to try. She spent her whole life being the one doing the work while someone else, or nothing at all, got the credit line: a Hollywood poster with another woman's name on it, a national newspaper crediting a man who wasn't even born when she first raced, a Hall of Fame induction that finally arrived 74 years late and 28 years too late for her to attend. The pattern was never subtle. It just took someone willing to lay every instance of it side by side to see how long, and how consistently, it ran. Now someone has.